The federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs erupted in bombshell testimony Tuesday. Claims of hush money for apparent sex tapes, bruised bodies, and alleged Trump Tower tryst. I'm going to be talking with our Law and Crime reporter Elizabeth Millner to break down the top moments from day 7 of testimony. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. That's right, Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients were improperly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes. You don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or head over to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. Well, the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs certainly took a turn Tuesday because you had witnesses who dropped these explosive allegations from Cassandra Ventura's mother talking about this alleged $20,000 payment that Sean Combs had demanded in exchange for returning or deleting this sex tape. Unbelievable testimony. Then you had a former insider who revealed this dark night involving guns and Suge Knight. You had an alleged revenge mission. Then I didn't even mention the testimony of this purported male sex worker who was hired to have sex with Cassandra Ventura in front of Combs. Yes, so Combs faces these charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, transporting individuals for purposes of prostitution. He's pleaded not guilty. The trial continued into day 7 today as prosecutors build their case, portraying the Bad Boy Records founder as this manipulative enforcer who used fear, money, violence to control those around him. So to help us get that special inside scoop on everything that went on inside that courtroom, I want to bring on our very own Law and Crime reporter, Elizabeth Millner. Our eyes, our ears for what is happening there day in and day out. Elizabeth, thanks so much for taking the time. Now, we're going to get into David James' testimony, the former personal assistant of Sean Combs. He continued his testimony. But how could I not start off with Cassie Ventura's mother, Regina Ventura, right? If Cassie Ventura is the star witness in this case, having her mother testify, unbelievable. Now, she talked about this moment that Diddy demanded money for one of Cassie's sex tapes. Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of went down in 2011, so nearly 14 years ago at this point, and it was around the holiday time that this happened. And it was kind of a little bit in relation to the whole Kid Cudi incident and just Cassie kind of pursuing Kid Cudi in a romantic fashion after Diddy introduced the two in the studio. Diddy got upset that Cassie was in this really very short relationship with Kid Cudi. And so around this time frame, again, this being December of 2011, Cassie came home for the holidays, something that her mother, Regina, had said that she often does. She always comes home around the holiday time. So then we see one of the exhibits around that time frame, this 2 days before Christmas of 2011, so December 23rd of 2011. We see an email that we had seen previously when Cassie was testifying, and that was the email sent to Cassie's mother, Regina, as well as Capricorn Clark, who had worked with Diddy at this time frame. And Cassie wrote in this email, the threats that have been made towards me by Sean Combs are he's going to release 2 explicit sex tapes of me, one on Christmas and maybe right before or right after, and another one sometime soon after that. He also said that he will be having someone hurt me and Scott being Kid Cudi, physically, and that it wouldn't be at the hands of it wouldn't be at the hands of Diddy. And so when Regina was testifying today just about this, Jesse, she was saying things like, the sex tapes threw me. I knew that he was trying to hurt my daughter. So what she did was she took out a $20,000 home equity loan because Diddy essentially demanded this because Regina said that Diddy was angry that he had spent money on Cassie and Cassie was with someone else. And so Regina had this this loan drafted. Then she got a check after she was able to deposit in her checking account. Got a check, sent it to the Bad Boy account. However, the money was returned to Regina Ventura just a couple days later. According to Regina, the money came back about 4 to 5 days later. And there was no type of conversation with Diddy just about this money even returning into her possession. But from Regina's standpoint, during this, she said that she was scared about her daughter's safety, and that's why she essentially complied with this demand. And so, it was kind of a big sticking point throughout her testimony today, something that the defense on their end, because we saw some argument arguments outside of the presence of the jury that they didn't want this testimony in today. They didn't want a jury to hear it. But lo and behold, this testimony definitely kind of changed things up, possibly for just how everyone's kind of interpreting the whole situation, how Cassie is involved, and especially with Regina kind of verifying that this kind of went down. But it was definitely a huge sticking point when Regina was on that stand.
I mean, we knew that Regina was going to take the stand as a form of corroborating Cassie Ventura's testimony. Cassandra Ventura basically testified that she was a victim of Sean Combs' sex trafficking, that she was coerced into these sexual episodes, that she was beaten, that she was threatened. And to have Regina take the stand, we knew she was going to be a form of corroborating testimony. I didn't expect this, the alleged $20,000 payment. The reason I say so much about corroborating testimony is I also understand there was a discussion regarding her taking photos of injuries of her daughter or something of that fashion. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the injuries to Cassie?
I can only imagine how hard it was for Regina to testify about this, because in this we're seeing exhibit photos of Cassie around this time with bruises on her body, something that she had testified to while she was under direct examination and even cross-examination as well too. But as far as Regina specifically goes, we were shown exhibits, photos again around this time frame, that being in 2011, and they showed Cassie kind of posed up. These photos were taken by Regina herself. Cassie had her head shaved at this point, and Regina made it a point to kind of point out to everyone that Cassie had her head shaved from around 2009 to about 2011. And again, these photos were taken around the 2011 time frame. But in that time frame, this was really the first time Cassie had even spoken to her mother about the physical violence that she endured at the hands of her then boyfriend, that then boyfriend obviously being Sean Combs, aka Diddy. And so Regina also brought up just a blind item that she had previously seen on the internet. A blind item is something that, you know, in my personal time I do kind of like to look at, and essentially it's just kind of like gossip about celebrities, but they don't necessarily use the names, and it's just ways to kind of get in gossip that sometimes can be true, sometimes it's a little fabricated, a little over the top. But in this specific case, Regina recalled seeing just a blind item about Cassie getting beaten in a car by Diddy, and then privately an exhibit photo was shown of somebody named Mia, somebody that who previously had worked for Diddy. This was shown privately, so we in the gallery, and I don't even believe that the jurors even saw this photo. But as far as just the photos that we did see today in court, it was just more of those bruised photos, more of the photos that Cassie again had bruises on her body. She was posing for her mom, and her mom kind of kept these photos, I guess kind of as a way for instances, possibly kind of like this one, where just if something were to happen, they have these photos to kind of corroborate Cassie's stories. But some of were different photos that we had seen earlier in the days of testimony, and then some of them were newer photos as well too. But I think they kind of really hit home with the jury there, just about everything that Regina saw her daughter go through during this time.
And I will tell you, I think the prosecution has done quite an exceptional job at proving there was physical violence against Cassandra Ventura. I mean, even the defense seemed to concede that there was domestic violence, but you couple the photographs, the testimony, both of Cassandra Ventura and supporting witnesses, the 2016 tape, definitely, I think the jury can make the assumption or go to the conclusion that she was physically abused. It does become a question, is that sex trafficking? Is that racketeering? That's a separate legal question. Now, did she also testify about a phone incident? If so, what's that about?
Yeah, so the phone incident just happened about 5 years later from the 2011 incident. So that means 11 plus 5, 2016. And so around this time was Cassie's 30th birthday. And so Regina had traveled from Connecticut to Los Angeles at the time where Cassie was living on the West Coast to essentially celebrate her daughter's birthday. And so, but what ended up happening was that Regina actually called the police. Why did she call the police? Because Diddy had taken Cassie's phone. Regina got upset about this whole incident, so she just immediately called the police after Cassie had told her about what happened. So what ended up happening on Regina's end is she got into an argument with Diddy outside of Cassie's apartment building. We saw an exhibit photo of Cassie's apartment building at the time where she lived on the 17th story. And she said during this argument with Diddy that D-Rock was present. His real name is Damian Butler, and that's what Regina had referred to him as, his government name, that being Damian Butler, as opposed to D-Rock, the name that a lot of people have used while they've been testifying throughout this trial. And during during this, D-Rock was kind of being the middleman in all of this, essentially trying to possibly de-escalate the situation, or at least at the bare minimum, just trying to protect Diddy from the wrath of Regina, because Regina said that while this was happening, that Diddy was holding Cassie's phone. D-Rock was in the middle of it, trying to kind of break up everything, and that Regina was admitting that she was trying to hit Diddy during this, because that's how essentially furious that she was. And so what ended up happening is that Diddy later gave Regina Cassie's phone back, but then what he ended up doing was taking Cassie's car instead. And so I think this kind of played into the prosecution's argument that, you know, if something were to happen, that Diddy would take things away from Cassie, such as her phone in one instance, such as her car in another instance. And so Regina said essentially that they ended up still celebrating Cassie's birthday around this time frame, but the thing is that Diddy wasn't there, so there was no Diddy at this birthday celebration or anything like that, especially after kind of the events that occurred. And even just looking at this time frame, this August 2016 was just a few months after the hotel incident that happened at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles. And so I think what the prosecution was doing was, again, trying to kind of drive home the point that if something were to happen, if Diddy didn't like something, that essentially he would take things away from Cassie. Sometimes her phone, again, sometimes her car. But again, at the end of the day, Regina kind of went into mama bear mode while she was even on the stand for the most part today, Jesse. She appeared very honest. She appeared like a compelling witness, kind of verifying some of the things that her daughter had said while on the witness stand just last week. And so I thought her testimony was possibly very powerful, especially kind of talking about how she didn't know about the physical violence that she endured by Diddy, or even just some of the things that she may have witnessed, for example, this phone incident that happened in August of 2016. And so I found her to be a very compelling witness. She appeared forthcoming while she was on the stand, again, even admitting that she at one point was so mad that she even tried to hit Diddy at that time. And so, yeah, I think she made for a very compelling witness while on the witness stand. And I know you might ask me a little bit about cross coming up, but unfortunately, everyone, there was no cross-examination. Probably a good move by the defense, because what type of questions would they end up asking essentially a victim's mom, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think they were probably of the opinion either they're not going to deny what she's saying, right? They've accepted a lot of this alleged violence, saying it's domestic violence, but doesn't amount to a federal crime, or they're of the opinion if we cross-examine her in such a way, perhaps it could turn the jury against us. And there's nothing we can gain from cross-examining what she had to say. So very strategic for them not to cross-examine her, but important witness nonetheless. Not the only important witness who took the stand. I understand that a man named Sheree Hayes took the stand, who goes by the stage name The Punisher. Now, talk to us about who this person is, because I understand he was hired by Diddy and Cassie. I understand he told the court about one specific sexual encounter with Cassie and Diddy that happened at the Trump Tower. So he was this male performer who was hired to have sexual relations with Cassie. What happened at the Trump Tower?
So when Sheree Hayes was initially called to the witness stand, I was thinking, you know, maybe he's somebody of Diddy's employees. We're just going to talk about his time working with Diddy, because when he had walked inside the courtroom today, Jesse, he was wearing a suit. He had a nice long tie on. He appeared very professional. And so when he got on the witness stand and said that he was a male exotic dancer, I think a lot of people were just like, oh, okay, he's one of the people. And then that's when we get into the nickname, The Punisher, a nickname that surprisingly he has had since his school days, essentially when he was playing sports and that type of thing. But while he was on the witness stand today, he was really kind of describing essentially just the fantasies that were being played out in these hotel rooms. And so for this, he was paid in the fall of 2012, paid to create a sexy erotic scene. He said he had met Cassie and Diddy after working at some type of club event. And then a woman had called him essentially saying that it was her birthday and that her husband said that she could hire a dancer. And so the Punisher, or Sheree Hayes, thought initially that he was going to be at a bachelorette party dancing for like a group of women to get them excited for the bachelorette. But then when he went to this hotel, what ended up happening was a woman met him in a bathrobe. She was wearing a wig. And she opened the door, and he later revealed that this woman was Cassandra Ventura, aka Cassie. And so this woman, while he was on the phone with her, because he said he had spoken to a woman either on the phone or through text messages, this woman asked to meet him at the Trump Tower and just come straight to the room. He thought it was going to be just $200 for a 45-minute show. And then again, he was greeted by Cassie at the door, again, thinking that he was expecting a crowd of bachelorettes who were excited for this type of performance. But again, it was just Cassie inside that room at first. And so he was told by Cassie during this that her husband wanted to her husband wanted her to put baby oil on each other and just kind of rub baby oil to kind of create this type of scene and play out this fantasy. And during this time, Cassie had handed him $800. So he was told one stipulation. He was told specifically not to acknowledge the husband or say anything to him. And then he had noticed that all the furniture was covered in sheets. Over to the side, there was some water. Over to the side, there was some baby oil. And that Cassie and the Punisher essentially just kind of rubbed and applied baby oil onto each other. During this, he says that a nude man came out, and this man who was essentially nude came out. He had Astroglide, and he recognized the Astroglide because he's an exotic dancer, something that he says he's used before. And this man had come out. Again, he's nude in this situation, but his face was covered. That was the thing. And during this time, the husband, per se, was pleasuring himself while giving Cassie essentially direction. And these directions and these points that he was saying was move to the side or position your bodies a certain way. And so the Punisher said, or Sheree Hayes, excuse me, he had said that this encounter lasted about 25 to 30 minutes. He didn't know it was Diddy being this husband during this incident, until later on. And so he said after this entire encounter, he actually got more money. He got $1,200 after this, and then he was contacted again and again and again, about 8 to 12 more times. And during this, he initially thought Cassie was a woman named Janet because this was the alias that she was using whenever she had contacted Sheree or the Punisher to kind of play out this fantasy essentially. But that's kind of what it went down at the Trump Tower during the fall of 2012.
Let me ask you this. So it's clear this is quite graphic testimony. And it's clear this may help support the transportation to engage in prostitution charge. If you're talking about commercial sex work, you're talking about prostitution, things of that nature. The question if this is sex trafficking all comes down to whether it was consensual or not. Did he say anything in his testimony to indicate that Cassandra Ventura was not on board with this? I mean, other than the fact that these seemed to be extended performances that were quite elaborate and intense, did he say anything to indicate to the jury that Cassie didn't want a part of this and was being forced into this?
Yeah, it was a lot of graphic testimony. Sometimes I was inside the gallery blushing a little bit because it was just so detailed in the way that either the prosecution was asking the questions or even Xavier Donaldson asking the questions under the cross-examination. But as far as consent specifically goes, the Punisher, Sheree Hayes, essentially said that he didn't have a thought process on Cassie's level of enjoyment during all of this because they were kind of creating a scene, playing out this fantasy essentially. And then there was a point where an objection occurred after this was said. You could tell that it was a fetish thing. This is what Sheree Hayes had said while on the witness stand. And then there was an objection from the defense. And so that part was, I believe it was struck from the record. But as far as consent goes overall, he said that Cassie at points would wince and she would sigh at some of the responses, in response to some of the directions that were given by her husband or Diddy at the time, and that she was kind of seeking cues, and then another objection by the defense, but that objection was overruled. But so they were able to kind of get in that she was essentially seeking cues from the other man inside that room. That man now we know to be Diddy. And then even he was asked just about drug intake and drinking intake, or alcohol intake, I should say. And he said that he didn't see Diddy doing drugs or drinking during this. And I think the prosecution is trying to kind of drive the point that he wasn't under the influence of doing anything while this was kind of going down, that this was intentional and that type of thing. But then they kind of get into times where he was explaining, he being the Punisher, was explaining that he was experiencing anxiety performing, essentially, because there was another man in the room yelling directions, and to the point that he just felt like he couldn't necessarily perform because, again, another man in the room kind of making him nervous, kind of making him anxious. And so it was a lot of graphic testimony, some stuff that I just won't necessarily go into. But as far as whether or not Cassie was consenting to these activities, it seemed like from the Punisher's standpoint that he sometimes couldn't gauge whether or not Cassie was really feeling it, or whether or not she just was just taking direction by what he had thought to be her husband and that type of thing.
Fascinating discussion with, I mean, we knew that he might take the stand because Cassie had mentioned a Punisher last week. What happened on cross-examination? Specifically, wasn't he asked about a book that he wrote or something?
Well, I gotta say, you know, despite having the name, an exotic dancer name, such as the Punisher, Sheree Hayes actually came off like a very nice guy while he was on the witness stand. He seemed very friendly. He was answering all the questions. If there was something that he didn't necessarily recall, he was very forthcoming about that. And so despite having kind of this aggressive name that he had used kind of as a nickname, you could say, just for his other life, that again, he appeared like a very nice man. But as far as the book goes, he had written a book just about kind of his encounters with Cassie and Diddy, but not necessarily naming their names in this book. But it was at least 6 pages in this book out of maybe a 150-page book. But this book was called In Search of Meat Freezer, an interesting book title. But it was essentially just about his problems performing, and just that he was talking about how he had gotten an implant for his genitalia during this. And so whenever he was examined by Xavier Donaldson, who did the cross, he was asked about this book. And so initially he was asked about, you know, being the co-owner now of Hunkelmania, which is an exotic dancer service, and he now owns a website called getpunished.com, and this is something that he's been doing for about 30 years. And it was interesting because I made in my notes, Jesse, that Diddy was like nodding, and he was nodding his head, looking at his attorney. He was pulling up his chair pretty close at the defense table. Couldn't tell if he was trying to gauge the jury during this testimony. But Xavier Donaldson was like, so you believed Cassie felt comfortable with you. Did you have feelings for Cassie? You thought you were the only one doing this type of activity with Cassie. And I felt like the defense was kind of trying to do similar to what they had done with Daniel Phillip, another exotic dancer who was a part of these types of sessions, while he was on the witness stand, kind of just insinuating that these escorts had feelings for Cassie. And the Punisher essentially said that he didn't have feelings for Cassie. He was asked about telling the entire truth, as far as the government asking him to tell the truth. But in a 2023 interview, he had told the government that I guess he had feelings for Cassie, but the Punisher had said that was taken out of context. And then at this point, the defense is kind of starting to ask for a play-by-play of the baby oil rubbing, and just kind of how the Punisher does strip teases and all of this stuff. They were again trying to drive home the point of whether or not Cassie was consenting to this activity, or maybe that Cassie felt comfortable with this activity because the Punisher kept coming back during these instances. So as far as the references in the book about Cassie and Diddy specifically, he did own up that he did make references to them in the book. He referred to them as a married couple, said that their story again took about 6 pages in this, and he kind of sensationalized the story for the book. Now at any moment I was just kind of in the courtroom thinking that they bring up the book or brought up the book as an exhibit or anything like that, but essentially they didn't. But they kind of talked about how he essentially was having trouble performing, and so he wrote this book as kind of like a self-help type of book to kind of just kind of talk with other men just about the same kind of problem. But I think that from the Punisher standpoint, I should say, that he was kind of driving home the point that after this one encounter where Diddy was kind of making him nervous essentially by being in the room, giving directions, that he just couldn't perform. And so he essentially just wrote a book off of that and just kind of used that one point as part of an example. Again, they didn't show the book or any exhibits during this testimony as far as the book and any type of pages of the book or anything like that. But I thought it was an interesting point and an interesting title, to say the least, In Search of Meat Freezer. So
you won't, I don't think any of us are going to forget that title anytime soon. I will say this much: It seems to me the value of his testimony is not, oh, he's the smoking gun to prove that this was all coerced sexual events, but a freak-off happened. These freak-offs happened. They were intense. They were elaborate. Sex workers were paid. Sometimes the prosecution, they just have to establish that fact before they move forward into what they're ultimately trying to prove to convict Sean Combs. So valuable witness. I'm not surprised we heard from him. I want to circle back. I want to circle back to the beginning of the day. So we heard the continued testimony of, this is Diddy's personal assistant, David James. So he was also back on the stand today. And he testified that as part of his job as a personal assistant, he had to do a number of things. And he had to set up the hotel rooms for Diddy. Now, I'm going to ask you what exactly that entailed and what he did, because to have the employees, to have the assistants, to have the security guards testify, that is key to the overall racketeering charge. This pattern of alleged criminal activity, a pattern of freak-offs being set up, that Sean Combs, remember, racketeering conspiracy, can't do it alone, that he operated this criminal enterprise. There have to be multiple people who helped him. I was really looking forward to David James's testimony to see if he ultimately moves the needle on the racketeering charge. So, if anybody wants to read the indictment of Sean Combs, it talks about how employees helped set up the hotel rooms for Diddy. What did he say that entailed?
Yeah, and so again, for everyone who doesn't know just yet, that David James had worked for Diddy for a 2-year time period from 2007 to 2009. And so he said during this time that his responsibilities included setting up the hotel rooms. He didn't necessarily book the hotel rooms as part of his job responsibilities, but these hotels were booked under Frank Black, and that it was an alias that Diddy used often. And so how they would kind of talk about these setting up the hotel rooms is they would call it advancing the hotel rooms. And so he would bring personal items to the hotel, such as clothes, such as toiletries, such as food. An interesting food thing that Diddy apparently likes is applesauce and Jell-O. And we learned in court today that Diddy weirdly puts applesauce on his cheeseburgers. And so that I thought was just kind of an interesting point. Very interesting to kind of say just about that entire thing. But that was during cross that we had learned that kind of little tidbit. But as far as just other items that he'd bring in other items such as toiletries, included skincare, razors just for men. David James would say that he would just get a key from the front desk and then set up the room, just go straight up and do that type of thing. But here's where I think the prosecution was kind of going. They were talking about how he was required to always bring a medicine bag and a personal Louis Vuitton bag, or an LV bag. And essentially inside this personal Louis Vuitton bag was money. It was wallets, personal items like that. But the money was a lot of money. It was about $10,000. I don't know about you, Jesse, but unfortunately for me, I do not have just $10,000 lying around in just a random bag or anything like that, even in my bank account. But not to kind of out myself there. But as far as just the LV bag and who normally carried this bag, it was normally security that carried in the bag. And so inside the LV bag, which he described as kind of being like a briefcase type bag, that there was also a medicine bag inside that bag. And that's where we kind of learn more of what normally Diddy was kind of carrying. And again, remember, this time frame was around 2007 to 2009 when David James was working for Diddy around this time. So inside that medicine bag was pills, Viagra, pills to increase sperm count, he says, ecstasy, Percocets, and that David James would replenish supplies if ever needed to with his own money. Then he would be reimbursed by Bad Boy to get his money back. But here's the thing, Jesse, is that there were certain items that were paid for in cash in order to not be going through the Bad Boy. And I think this kind of plays a little bit into count one, that items such as condoms, lube, Astroglide, prophylactics were all paid in cash. They were not paid on the card. He would get cash essentially from security guards like Bonds that he had mentioned, and they essentially just didn't want a money trail going through Bad Boy. But what another interesting point is that David James had said on the stand that it wasn't just women like Cassie specifically staying in these hotels, that other girls would stay in these hotels as well too. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting revelation as far as, you know, he wasn't replenishing these hotels to kind of just set these rooms up for Diddy and Cassie specifically, that these rooms were set up and other women would go to these rooms as well too. Again, from that 2007 to 2009 time frame when David James was working in Diddy's employment.
Now, I also understand that he talked about Diddy having some sort of footage of him, I don't know, maybe as a way to blackmail him, intimidate him. Again, important characteristics, elements to talking about Sean Combs' alleged criminal empire and getting people to do what he wanted. What did we learn about that?
Yeah, so David James, when he's inside that courtroom, he appears just kind of very just straight and narrow, appears very honest and forthcoming, and he seems like he took his job as a personal assistant to Diddy very seriously, like he takes his other jobs. And so he admitted that during his time under Diddy's employment, that at one point he had taken drugs like ecstasy, and this was during a New Year's Eve party. He says that during this time he doesn't partake in drugs or necessarily too much alcohol, but during this particular New Year's Eve party, he was vibing, he was enjoying himself, something that they referred to as Diddy bopping a little bit. There was light laughter in the courtroom kind of during this part of the testimony, that David James was talking about how he was drinking Ciroc. Again, this being a New Year's Eve party, they were all enjoying themselves. But he says the day after, Diddy was reviewing this footage because, you know, we have to think about Diddy during this time frame. He's a very high profile person, and that he had a videographer there at this New Year's Eve party, and this videographer filmed the entire party. So the next day, Diddy was reviewing this footage by the videographer, and this is what David James said that Diddy had told him: "I want to keep this footage in case I ever need it." Now, it's unclear whether or not maybe at the time that this was happening, that this was kind of a joke and jest, but from what David James had said on the stand, he kind of took this, that this might possibly be a threat. But from my understanding, I'm just kind of like, how could it be a threat if you're just like vibing and enjoying yourself? You're not being inappropriate or anything like that. But again, David James kind of took heed to this statement that Diddy had allegedly made to him, and thought that this should be taken as a threat and taken very seriously. So that was definitely a point that they had talked about during his testimony this morning.
Did he also talk about security measures and specific procedures that Combs' security team took, which again, very important to understand who Combs surrounded himself with, who he relied on, what were actions, if you take the allegations as true, that this criminal enterprise engaged in. So what about security measures?
Yeah, so some of the security measures even included having employees take lie detector tests. So for example, there was a time frame, he couldn't remember what point it was at what year, from 2007 to 2009, but a Cartier bracelet went missing. And for those who don't know Cartier is very, very expensive, something I definitely cannot afford right now. But David James says that he was at a hotel, he got a knock on the door. The knock was from Uncle Paulie, somebody who had worked security for Diddy, and that security essentially went through all of David James's belongings, and that he felt like he couldn't tell Uncle Paulie no about going through his items, through his personal belongings. And David James had talked about how some of the other staff may have allegedly stolen, or at least that other items were stolen from Diddy during his time working with the then mogul. But he said that David James said that he had to take a lie detector actually twice while on the job. He said another instance is when cash went missing, that David James had to take a lie detector test during this. He said it happened in his first year of working for Diddy and called the experience pretty intimidating. He again felt like he couldn't say no in order to continue to keep his job. Then he said a second time that he was hooked up to a lie detector test, that Diddy's watch was stolen, and he took another lie detector test at the same location. It was this big building that he described with somebody who had previously worked in law enforcement doing the lie detector test. Diddy wasn't inside the room when this lie detector test was administered or anything like that. It was literally David James and the administrator of the lie detector test. And he said the lie detector administrator, per se, noted that David James felt a little more nervous this second time around. And David James, while he was on the stand, says he did take some items from Diddy, but that they were bottles of Ciroc, a brand that Diddy has represented a number of times, as well as a pair of Sean John jeans, because he says that he was a huge fan of the brand, a huge fan of just the clothing line. And so he said that he had taken some Sean John jeans, but he said he never took the money or the watch, and he actually passed the lie detector test. But one thing I thought that was interesting is that Diddy hated when people had stole from him, which kind of makes sense a little bit, right, Jesse? You have a big, giant staff. You're a rich mogul at this time. A lot of people working, a lot of people coming in and out. Then your items are stolen, and then you're trying to figure out essentially who stole what and why did they steal that type of thing. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting point, mainly because I'm trying to figure out, again, kind of how that kind of plays into the RICO conspiracy, because maybe it's possibly other celebrities also kind of do these types of work whenever something happens inside their home, whether or not items are stolen. Kind of how do you get to the bottom when things like that happen within your staff and your employees? And so right as we were kind of getting into the end of the lie detector portion, David James had mentioned that Capricorn Clark, who had also worked for Diddy, who had been mentioned a number of times throughout testimony since the trial began, also took a lie detector test because a loose diamond fell out of a chain. And then they were talking about how at one point they swapped the chain for fake diamonds. It was just like a whole thing. So it seems like from David James's testimony that this was something that happened often, as far as, you know, trying to make the employees or the staff kind of fess up if they were to have stolen something by doing an intimidating process like take a lie detector test.
I get it. I see what the prosecution's doing there. I'll tell you one thing that's different between Diddy and other celebrities. Suge Knight. Let's finish up the courtroom recap with Suge Knight, because we know Cassandra Ventura had testified last week about this incident where she and Combs, I believe, had finished a freak off. Somebody comes in, says that his rival, his enemy, Suge Knight, is at Mel's Diner. They pick up, they leave, seemingly maybe to go attack him. So you think about Cassandra Ventura, this environment of alleged violence, alleged threats, you know, intimidation, guns. This goes to the overall theme of a criminal enterprise. It goes to the overall theme of force, fraud, coercion, and sex trafficking, what she was around, why she felt maybe the need to comply with Diddy if he's a violent character, taking those allegations as true. But Suge Knight came up today in David James' testimony. What did he say about Suge Knight and that whole incident?
Well, the entire incident is why he no longer works for Diddy or even works for Bad Boy at this time. And so this incident happened in the fall of 2008. At this time, they were coming back from the studio. Diddy wanted cheeseburgers. Not sure if he wanted applesauce on these cheeseburgers or anything like that, but essentially that they were just going to go get food from a place over in California called Mel's Diner, somewhere that David James says he had been a number of times before. And so David James had said during this that he had driven over to Mel's Diner. D-Rock was riding shotgun, i.e. in the passenger seat. And then D-Rock said to David James, "That's that mother effer Suge Knight." So then they get out of the car. D-Rock said to Suge Knight specifically, "What's up? It's me, Biggie's boy. You're in my city." And for a lot of people who may not know, there was a huge East Coast versus West Coast beef, where it was kind of Bad Boy versus Death Row Records. Obviously, Suge Knight and Tupac on one side, that being the West Coast, Diddy then going by Puff Daddy, Puffy at the time, and Biggie, Biggie Smalls, Notorious B.I.G., whatever you want to call him, kind of represented the East Coast. So the beef goes back for decades at this point, because again, this happened in 2008, but still it kind of ranged true a little bit today as well. But around this time, David James has said they went inside to order some food, and then more SUVs arrived. And then he saw one person actually hand a weapon. This is what David James had said while he was under direct, hand a gun to Suge Knight. And D-Rock had told David James that we have to go back. And so what did they end up doing? They went back to Diddy's home. And so once they arrived back to Diddy's home, Diddy and Cassie were arguing outside, David James explained. And Cassie was essentially telling Diddy not to go down there, not to just go and, I guess, try to confront Suge Knight, allegedly. And so what ended up happening, according to David James, is that D-Rock, Diddy, and David James all went to find Suge Knight. David James had explained while he was on the stand that Diddy had 3 handguns just sitting in his lap while he was riding in the backseat of the car, but that David James had driven back to Mel's Diner. It took about 10 minutes to get there, and essentially they were going to confront Suge Knight. But what ended up happening is once they got to Mel's Diner, there were no more SUVs when they had returned, and that Diddy actually told David James to kind of circle around, see if they could find Suge Knight anywhere. And this is where David James is essentially like, "This is the first time I thought my life was in danger." He really possibly thought that a shooting was going to go down, a big confrontation, that this really could get possibly bloody and terrible if, you know, those two were to kind of come to a head. But David James says that this was essentially the reason that he quit. He didn't like that his life was in danger. He said he ended up giving a 6 months notice shortly after, so that way he could train the next personal assistant to come up. And he said by May of 2009, because again, this incident happened in fall of 2008, by May of 2009, David James was no longer interested in working there. He didn't want to even go off to other different ventures, kind of in the Diddy sphere, because he says that he was offered other jobs in other kind of departments between, again, that Diddy sphere of all just the different business endeavors that he was working on at that time. But he said no, he didn't want any part of it and left his job position in May of 2009.
And what happened on cross-examination? Because this is a key witness, right? This is another member of Sean Combs' inner circle. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more who testify, maybe a possible chef who will testify, maybe go to the forced labor allegations. But what had happened on cross-examination, real quick?
Yeah, as far as cross-examination goes, this was done by Mark Agnifilo. And Mark Agnifilo was really kind of trying to pinpoint as far as just what happened and what occurrence in this type of chronological order. And then at one point, Mark Agnifilo was like, did you speak with the government this morning? This morning being as far as today. And David James, while on the stand, was essentially like, I can't recall what was talked about just this morning between federal prosecutors and himself. But essentially, the prosecutors were telling him what to kind of expect during cross-examination and just Mark Agnifilo's type of style. There was a little light laughter in the courtroom. But Mark Agnifilo was kind of trying to drive home the point. If David James can't remember what happened a couple hours ago, how can he remember an incident that happened in 2008? Now, there was another key point, Jesse, that they were talking about during his cross-examination, and that they brought up a Chef Jordan during this cross, again, by Mark Agnifilo with David James. And there was a point where they were kind of trying to talk about this incident that happened with Chef Jordan. This happened in Miami. Chef Jordan was essentially trying to tell David James how to do his job. And during this incident, David James admitted to grabbing Chef Jordan by both of her wrists and saying to stay in her effing lane. And this incident ended up being reported to Bad Boy HR. Diddy ended up speaking with David James afterwards. But what was interesting, Jesse, is that Diddy told David James not to put his hands on a woman. And so whenever the redirect happened, they were trying to drive home the point, they being the prosecutors were trying to drive the point, Diddy told you that Diddy might have allegedly hit Chef Jordan after telling David James that you can't hit a woman. And then obviously we know of the other instances of physical violence that happened throughout the relationship with Cassie. And so this incident between Diddy and Chef Jordan actually happened in Alpine, New Jersey. Diddy asked David James to file a police report saying that Chef Jordan was actually the one to hit Diddy first. And David James says that he essentially just lied to Diddy, drove around to that area, never filed the police report because he didn't want to file a false report. And so I think that, during the cross-examination, while the defense was trying to kind of poke holes, the prosecution kind of, brought it back a little bit as far as being like, you were instructed to file false police reports at the instruction of your boss. And so I could see where both the cross was going with this, but also the redirect was going. But overall, I felt like David James's testimony, he seemed, again, pretty honest while he was on the witness stand. He seemed very forthcoming with this whole Chef Jordan incident that involved David James specifically. But overall, those were just kind of the big moments of his cross-examination and a little bit of his redirect.
I don't know how much that's going to stick for the jury if Diddy says don't put a hands on a woman when there's tape of him allegedly doing just that. Before I let you go, Elizabeth, I got to ask you about the jury. I know it's sometimes impossible to know what they're thinking, what they're paying attention to, but sometimes you get a little bit of clues. A lot for them to listen to today. Can you glean anything from how they were reacting to testimony or not reacting to any testimony?
Yeah, for the most part, the most non-reaction I would say I got from them is when the Homeland Security investigator was kind of testifying, because, Jesse, we know how these kind of testimony goes. It's very, very specific, and it takes a little while to just kind of drive home the point a little bit. But as far as just the other impactful witnesses that were on the stand today, such as Regina Ventura, the jurors, from what I could see of them, were directly focused on her. Again, some of these jurors, they look back at the prosecutor or even the defense attorney who's doing the questioning, they go back to the witness on the stand. And so for the most part, we're just in the second week of trial. And from what I could see of these jurors, they're still very invested. They come in, they take their notes. But I did think one funny thing is that we kind of got court held up on a delay, at least this morning, mainly because 4 jurors were late to court this morning because there were some train issues that, we can all understand us who live in New York City and that type of thing. But these jurors are pretty hard to read. I can't tell if they're thinking the same thing I'm thinking or what we are in the press are thinking, those who know a little bit more about the case. But it's really sometimes hard to tell because they're not very overly emotional. Even when they had that graphic testimony and that kind of sexual testimony that was going on when Sheree Hayes was on the witness stand, there wasn't kind of the reaction or even necessarily the blushing that maybe we in the gallery were kind of subjected to just a little bit. But man, they are hard to read, that jury, I will say.
Yes, they are. A lot for them to consider, and it's only middle of week 2. Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much for your great reporting, as always.
Thanks, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.